Hello everyone. Today we're going to be learning about how new species form, or in other words, speciation, how it happens. So what is a species? A species is a group of animals that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. And the key thing there is that they're able to produce fertile offspring. For example, if you were to take two breeds of dogs, like a poodle and a golden retriever. You could breed them, and they would produce puppies that could also produce offspring. So even though golden retrievers and poodles look very different from each other, they are considered to be the same species because they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. On the other hand, if we take a horse and a donkey and breed them together, they can produce offspring, and these are called mules, but the mule itself is sterile. Two mules cannot breed and produce offspring. So in Darwin's Origin of Species, he proposed that each living species had descended from older species with small changes. And this idea is known as common descent. So we ended up with, you know, some sort of ancient animal that was a vertebrate, and it would branch off. And natural selection would favor different adaptations for different areas until we end up with the variety of different species that we have today. So, for example, we have some sort of mammal ancestor existed. Natural selection would occur in one pathway and would select for traits that eventually ended up in our chimpanzees. And natural selection in a different direction would select for traits that are common in bears. And so, this is how we get different species. So, in other words, small changes will cause a change in the appearance of a species over time. So, for example, we have this bird here, and over time, different changes occurred to favor different physical traits in the new species because of natural selection. Or in some cases, one species will split into two different species. So, for example, we see this branch over here. This could happen if a population becomes isolated from another population, and natural selection is happening favoring different traits in a different environment than in the original population. So new species evolve as populations become isolated from each other. And the second Edpuzzle video talks about the different ways that populations become isolated. One way that populations can become isolated is geographically. For example, if we take all of these salamanders, at one point there was just one type of salamander living in this area, but each group of salamanders became isolated from each other in different areas of California, and there were different environments that each group had to adapt to over thousands of years until they became isolated for so long. If you were to bring this salamander and this salamander together, they would not be able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring, causing them to have be two different species. So, for example, we take an original population of mice and we isolate them somehow geographically. And for example, we have a river running through and separating the two populations of mice. And then over many, many years, natural selection occurs in these two different mice populations. causing one type of appearance to be favored in one area and another to be favored in another area. And if enough genetic differences accumulate, you could have a situation where if you were to mix these two populations together again, they would not be able to interbreed. I will also mention that you don't necessarily have to have geographic isolation for this. The second Edpuzzle video talks about different ways of reproductive isolation. Sometimes they can happen within the same area. For example, if some mice are out during the daytime and some are at nighttime, then it's not very likely that two types of mice would get together and interbreed, and causing that could lead to a buildup of genetic differences. So that way, if you were to bring the two mice together and try to get them to interbreed and produce offspring, they weren't able to. So even though this happens in the same area, they're active at different times of day. Or another example would be bird calls. If you have one bird that sings one type of song and attracts mates, but another bird sings a different song and it attracts a different group of mates, then the two different groups of birds are unlikely to interbreed. So you don't necessarily have to have this geographic piece. Speciation can happen quite frequently as long as reproductive isolation is happening. And the second Edpuzzle video talks about a whole bunch of examples of reproductive isolation. The last thing I want to mention is this concept of adaptive radiation. This is when a single species becomes many different species. And one example is the finches in the Galapagos. An ancestral seed-eating finch colonized the islands of the Galapagos, but then each island was geographically isolated from the other islands, and each island had its own environment. And so these finches became specialized to the particular environment in the different islands, which led to all these different finches. So each group of finches on each island had different selective pressures that led to some having bigger beaks, eating different types of foods, different colors of feathers. So natural selection is what causes the changes between the different populations of birds in this example. But if in order to stop the genes from mixing and the traits from mixing in between the populations, they have to be isolated.